Sometimes when people do sequels, they try to pick what they think worked in the first one and repeat it. Whereas this movie goes in a completely different version. It's almost as if it's an anti-Joker. It goes in a
Right.
way so unexpected. So were you trying to do that? Not to cash on the success of the first, but to use it to explore new grounds?
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly what we're trying to do. Again, I don't want to speak for Joaquin. I hate to speak for him when I'm sitting next to him, but I don't know that Joaquin would have done a version where it just felt like, as you say, a line drive, something really easy and like, okay, obviously this is where we're going to go with the second movie. He is only going to do something that challenges him. He's only going to do something that feels intimidating and unmakeable in some regards. And quite frankly, as a filmmaker, it's not as fun to not, when you have the ability, the movie was such a success that you are able to kind of use that goodwill and do something, really challenge yourself.
Like Arthur Fleck, I'm living in a fantasy. I must be. How else could one explain my determination to defend Joker Folie à Deux against the mobs who are going on and on about how the film is objectively an utter disaster? The critics and fans of 2024 have spoken. The sequel to Todd Phillips' 2019 Academy Award-winning Joker has united viewers in the worst manner conceivable. Word of mouth is spreading at a rapid pace, and the box office numbers reflect what some are calling a complete catastrophe. Joker grossed over $1 billion, the highest grossing R-rated film up until recently with the release of Deadpool and Wolverine. With a reported budget of around $200 million, nearly 4 times that of the first film, Joker Folie à Deux is projected to lose tens of millions, the likes of which we rarely see for production of this scale. The world is telling you and I not to see it, save your money, don't waste your time, that it's one of the worst comic book movie sequels and one of the worst sequels in the history of filmmaking. So like I said, I must be living in a fantasy because after 2 viewings, with the third one well on the way, I'm smiling from ear to ear on the inside and singing its praises to everyone who will listen, online and off. Tell me I'm mentally ill, tell me I'm trolling, tell me I just like to be different or what have you, but I did not walk out of the theater watching the same film the majority of moviegoers did, and I'm here to break down the plaguing criticisms Joker Folie à Deux is undergoing and argue for why I personally adore this adaptation. There appears to be what I'd call almost an unintentional mass gaslighting attempt to convince audiences that Folie à Deux undoes everything its predecessor set up, and that somehow director and writer Todd Phillips intentionally wanted his film to fail, and that he wanted to intentionally upset viewers, giving them a massive middle finger. I couldn't disagree more, as I truly believe Joker Folie à Deux not only to be a cinematic revelation, but a visionary interpretation of the Joker mythos. Spoilers ahead, folks. Let's begin with this unfounded false claim that Joker Folie à Deux somehow ruins 2019's Joker. Firstly, I don't subscribe to the idea that a sequel can ever ruin the original. There have been many examples throughout pop culture history where sequels have killed franchises, and yes, hurt the reputation of what's come before it, but that original movie or series will always remain good on its own merit. It's an immature attitude to boycott what you enjoy or what you enjoyed about something just because the next installments didn't deliver all you hoped and dreamed. If I lived by that rule, I wouldn't be a fan of anything. Neither would you, I imagine. Secondly, the only way in which Folie à Deux could ruin the first film is if the sequel recontextualized it in a complete overhaul, retconned its events, or established that everything in Joker didn't actually happen in reality. None of these are the case, however. On the contrary, Joker Folie à Deux functions as an extension of 2019's Joker, an answer to itself, and a prolonged epilogue walking us through the aftermath of what Arthur Fleck, shall we say, accomplished on the Murray Franklin show that night on live television. This film acknowledges the gravity of violent acts head on and is concerned with the effects of violence on society to varying degrees. Tell me the last time a comic book movie on the big screen, if we're going to call these 2 films comic book movies, directly addressed such a psychologically abstract but universally relevant issue. The answer is never. In a genre of storytelling where violence is ubiquitous as well as synonymous with comic book heroes and villains themselves, telling a story about the Joker where the Joker himself doesn't kill anyone in the movie except in his fantasies is fascinating, not stupid. Anyone could have told the story of Joker and Harley Quinn escaping Arkham Asylum and taking over Gotham City in a Bonnie and Clyde fashion, but how many times has that story been told? And how predictable? Would we have bought someone in Arthur's condition to have become the clown prince of crime, acting as a mob boss with goons under him? No. This interpretation of the Joker persona was never that, especially in light of Arthur's mental illnesses, impulsivity, awkwardness, and stunted behavior. Could we instead have had a commentary on a toxic relationship between Joker and Harley? Well, we did, except the roles were reversed in Folie à Deux, with Arthur being the manipulated and Harley acting as the manipulator. The possibilities of what could have been can only take us so far and will always lead us nowhere when the film itself is right in front of us as we speak and the conversation around it is so divisive. There's a difference between giving the people what they want and giving the people what they didn't know they wanted. It's the latter where artistic vision is born. Otherwise, we're held captive to what the world wants and not what the artist feels the world needs.
Now, you really took a bold path with this film, moving further away from the comic book characters' roots. Is there any part of you that worries how DC fans could react given that it's so different than they may expect?
No. I mean, I don't mean that in a rude way, but it's just not what you can't necessarily concern yourself with that when you're making films, when you're creating art or whatever you're doing. You have to kind of ignore the results to some extent and do your thing. Yeah, so no, and I don't mean that in a way of like we don't care. It's more just like
listen, I
just gets in
that.
the way of the thing
of the storytelling. Absolutely,
yeah.
I agree with that.
There's a lot of talk regarding subverting audience expectations these days, and this sequel is being accused of doing exactly that. But how can you subvert what hasn't been established? The trailers didn't lie to us, and the first film made no promises. We knew Folie à Deux was going to consist of musical numbers but not be a full-on musical far ahead of its release, and if you weren't privy to that information, that's not the movie's fault. This film does not belong in the same conversations as The Last Jedi or The Last of Us Part 2 in terms of how jarring the experience is. The decision Arthur makes to take responsibility for his actions when he says there is no Joker happens at the conclusion of the movie after almost 2 hours of framing this thematic and inner conflict for the audience. It didn't come out of nowhere, and it only occurs after the murder of a cellmate by one of the guards at Arkham, and what has to be one of the most unsettling but highly effective scenes of its entire runtime. Many contribute Arthur's decision to abandon the Joker identity, or his shadow self, a psychological concept coined by Carl Jung and relayed to us in Folie à Deux's opening Looney Tunes sequence, on account of the brutal abuse he suffers at the hands of the Arkham guards. But it's made clear that, in the same way Arthur embraces becoming Joker in the first movie, this is a progression and not a bait-and-switch tactic on the film's part. The first movie is about the gradual masking of the Joker, while the second is about the gradual unmasking of the Joker. What broke Arthur wasn't the prison guards, rather it was this charade he had been playing at that eventually killed a fellow inmate and ruined the life of his friend Gary Puddles. During this specific scene, while Arthur hears the guards strangling the inmate to death, the movie cuts to the iconic moment from the first Joker where Arthur is dancing in the bathroom. The dancing portion was completely improvised by Joaquin Phoenix while shooting. Arthur was originally just supposed to lock himself in the bathroom and wash the makeup off in a panic. If you were paying attention, you'd remember that this scene cuts before showing Arthur wash his makeup off in the sink. But in this flashback sequence in Folie à Deux, that's not what happens. Todd Phillips decided to extract that same footage and finish the scene, letting the camera roll before cutting it on the editing room floor. It's here that we see the man behind the makeup. The symbolism is all over Folie à Deux, and for some odd reason, audiences refuse to see it.
You use music in this film really well to dive into the mind of Arthur Flick. Mm-hmm. Now, what is it about music you think connects us to our fantasies, to our realities, to our identity?
I mean, I think just music for everyone is the soundtrack of their life, and everybody has a different soundtrack in some ways, but something Joaquin and I talked about really early on in the first film was that Arthur while he might be left-footed with the world, while he might be out of step with the world, he has this music inside of him, and that came out in the first movie. Remember, he's dancing in the bathroom, or he dances when he comes out on Murray. So yeah, it was just a big part of the character of Arthur for us. So this seemed like a logical place to go, even though it seems kind of crazy on the outside.
Some have made a point to classify Joker Folie à Deux as a failed musical, but Phillips is on record stating that the film is not a musical, so it shouldn't be regarded as such. It's a disingenuous criticism holding a film up to a standard it's not trying to reach, it's not trying to be. The phrase folie à deux is French for shared madness or a delusion shared by two people, and all of the musical numbers relate to this theme of showing Joker and Harley's relationship through song and fantasy. The musical elements are contextualized after Lee and Arthur meet in music therapy, and the music teacher talks about, and I quote, "We use music to make us whole, to balance the fractures within ourselves," unquote. This shouldn't come as a surprise. After all, it's right there in the teaser trailer. The songs chosen fit the tonal language of the films themselves and provide a deeper layer of twisted romance that mere dialogue couldn't attain. Watching Lady Gaga sing the Carpenters' Close to You to Arthur had me entirely spellbound. I'm not going to say that audiences are too dumb for Joker Folie à Deux. I'd like to, but clearly there's a reason why the film hit theaters dead on arrival. Clearly there's a disconnect, but I couldn't tell you what that disconnect was, and frankly, the reasons being given don't make much sense to me. You can't tell me director Todd Phillips and cinematographer Lawrence Sher didn't shoot the hell out of Folie à Deux. Phoenix and Lady Gaga gave Oscar-worthy performances, and the soundtrack, including the musical bits, were tender, raw, and captivating. Everyone who worked on the first film came back for the second. The same director, the same writers, the same actors. Suggesting that Todd Phillips sabotaged his own movie is ludicrous because nothing about the movie is cheaply done. Don't let me catch you talking about it in the same breath as Madam Web. That should honestly be a crime. Critics and audiences criticize the first Joker for being a taxi driver and King of Comedy clone, and yet when given a film unlike anything we've seen, it's too audacious to appreciate. As far as I can tell, the biggest gripe people have comes down to disagreeing with the film's thesis, and the thesis of Folie à Deux is that the Joker is more of an idea or contagion than a person. Good luck with that argument, because that's exactly what Joker is, an avatar of chaos. He is a symbol. He is an idea. No one cares about the man, only the makeup, and the film comments on this very thing quite literally because Harley only loves when Arthur is Joker, not Arthur himself, and leaves him because he no longer lives up to her design. For goodness sake, Todd Phillips deserves nothing less than a round of applause for putting that on display and articulating it for us so brilliantly. I'm in agreement with what Francis Ford Coppola wrote when he said Todd Phillips, quote, is always one step ahead of the audience, unquote, after seeing Joker Folie à Deux. Granted, Coppola's endorsement may be ill-timed considering the somewhat comparable response to Megalopolis, but in a day and age where franchises dominate theaters and all comic book movies tend to look, feel, touch, and taste the same, I'm begging to see some sort of vision. Don't give me a studio movie, give me a film. Don't give me a cinematic universe full of fan service and cameos without reason, give me a film. Give me a vision. Give me style. Damn it, give me art. Art I can chew on, debate over, wrestle with, and be mystified by. I'm tired of walking out of a cinema and feeling indifferent about what I just watched. These Joker films were never franchise movies. The first one was supposed to be a one-off but performed so well that we were given a second one, but nothing about this movie feels forced or tired. Instead of lifting up Joker as a heroic martyr of society, the film sobers up the audience by asking them, is it the man or what he represents that you're more in love with?
We got a lot to talk about. 'Cause this movie is one of the most unique, comic book movie experiences, if you can call it a comic book movie, because it feels so different than what other comic book movie formulas are doing, right?
Sure.
And I'm a really big fan of what you did with the first Joker.
Okay, great.
But it seems like with this movie, you've elevated this to where you want to, in a way, put Joker on trial, both figuratively and literally.
Sure.
And not just the character, but just the mythos and legend behind the Joker, right?
Yeah,
and everything
right.
you think about him.
That's right.
Do you talk to me about taking a character that's usually, when we see him, it's all about the enigma and the mystery of his past, and then you put his past on display to put him on trial? Talk to me a little bit about doing that.
Well, for us, it was always from the very first one about taking the things we all know and grew up and have sort of familiar with Joker, and running it through a different lens and saying, what would that look like if you ran it through, I mean, quite frankly, for us, a more realistic lens. And not to say that means it's better than the other versions or less.
Right.
It's just a different way of looking at this story. The way I always think of it, like these comic book movies get retold the way Shakespeare's retold. You know,
exactly, yeah.
Baz Luhrmann did a much different version of Romeo, a very different version of Romeo and Juliet than, you know, whatever, you know, it's like everyone could take these stories and kind of make them their own. So we did that with Joker, and in that same way, continuing of running it through a realistic lens is sort of where we went with this.
I have a theory that audiences are just so used to being spoon-fed baby formula nowadays, and anytime there's real food in front of them, they don't know what to do with it. It's a theory with a lot of cynicism attached, but it's frustrating and isolating to witness a piece of art you're rather fond of be torn apart by people who don't understand it. It's like listening to a beautiful song that you can't wait to share, but when you do, the other person can only point out what's wrong with it. It's too long, the singing is bad, the instrumentation is mediocre, and the melody is laughable. At what point are you two not listening to the same song anymore? It's kind of heartbreaking because that song speaks to you in a way no one else gets. Perhaps Joker Folie à Deux wasn't made for someone like you, but it sure was made for someone like me. Yes, I think I prefer living in this fantasy after all.
When we were struggling to get Joker made, which sounds funny because it exists in the superhero world, but it's really not one of those movies. In fact, it was greatly inspired by the works of Martin Scorsese and Sidney Lumet and other filmmakers that I sort of grew up worshiping in the 70s and early 80s and their movies. But we had a really hard time getting that film made, which seems insane today, now seeing how well the movie's done. We spent a year at Warner Brothers, and I saw emails back and forth, literally where they said, does he realize, meaning me, does he realize we sell Joker pajamas at Target? And so
Is that true?
It's very what you're saying. Where and I go, doesn't the movies come first, the pajamas come second? Like, are the pajamas dictating the movies?
No.
You can't make your decisions based on that. And that was my argument, of course, was we're really going to dictate, movies based on pajamas. But it exists, this idea.
But you know those pajamas when you see them.
How do you navigate that system? How do you deal with Warner Bros? Do you get one person to be your ally?
Yeah,
or
you do. And one by one. I mean, the problem at Warner's for me was the regimes change so often.
Oh, God, yes.
At a lot of
Yeah.
studios,
Yeah,
studios, and so you finally get everybody on board, and all of a sudden they're gone. And now you're starting over, and when you start over with, sometimes people don't like to inherit other stuff from
Definitely
other people,
not.
right? So you're
King of Comedy was a good example.
Was it?
Yeah.
So you're overcoming that, but I mean, this film in particular, luckily we had the head of marketing who didn't change, Blair Rich, who really championed it from the script and got what we were trying to do, got that it was sort of an anti-comic book movie, so to speak.